Well, we all know that in order to make a good cake, you have to have a good recipe. Some women have the recipe in their heads. Some women need to read it from a recipe book. But at the end of the day, a good recipe makes a good cake. And if you read the recipes, you'll see the words 1/3, 1/4, 1/2, etc., etc. And, as we read the Bible, we notice very similar language. We see 1/3 and biblical fractions, as it were. And today I've got a very special guest on here to describe, to explain, to get us on the right track here with respect to biblical fractions. Carl Gallups, what does it all mean, sir?
Well, thank you, Mike, for having me on the show tonight. Hey, listen, give me a little bit of time to set the table for this,
Yes.
because that's a brilliant question you've asked, and it's an important question because, listen, we find those fractions mainly, of course, we think in the book of Revelation, we think of, especially like in the trumpet visions. 1/3 of the earth was covered in darkness, 1/3 of the sea, 1/3 of the ships in the sea, 1/3 of the people, etc. And so people have debated, theologians have debated for literally 2,000 years. Are those numbers literal? What do those numbers mean? When you get into the bowls being poured out, you run into the number 2/3. 2/3 of the earth was covered in this, and 2/3 of the land of this, and again you run into more fractions. And again, the question is: are these literal numbers? Are they symbolic numbers? What does it all mean? Well, let me just start this way. First of all, I want to say to our listeners, I do not claim to have full knowledge of eschatology. I don't claim that I'm 100% correct in my eschatology. I'm always leaving room to be contextually corrected. I always leave room to learn and to grow. I do not want to make the mistake that the Pharisees made, and let me remind our listeners what that was. In the name of God, inside the city of God, outside the temple of God, just outside the gates of the temple of God, they crucified the Son of God, thinking they were doing God a favor, Mike.
Right.
And you know the evidence they used to crucify the Son of God? Their settled eschatology. You are not the Christ. You can't be the Christ. We know who you are. We know where you came from. You just claim to be the Christ. I ask you, tell us plainly, are you the Christ, the Son of the living God? Jesus answered, I am. Caiaphas said, blasphemy. He is worthy of death.
Right.
It doesn't fit our eschatology.
Right. Right. And
Mike, they had it all figured out as to who the Christ was, what he was going to look like, what he was going to do, what was going to happen to Rome, what was going to happen to Israel, and Jesus didn't fit the bill. Therefore, they crucified him in the name of their eschatology.
As often as he tried to point them to the scriptures, which directly referred to himself, they refused.
Yes, but they didn't know the scriptures in their context.
Right.
And so they had a settled eschatology, and they basically said, if you don't believe like we believe, you're going to go to hell.
Right.
And Jesus, of course, set them straight, didn't believe like they believed, and they crucified him. So I say all that to say this to the listeners. I don't want to make that mistake. I don't walk the fence in my eschatology, and I'm not mealy-mouthed about it, but I try to be humble about it, Mike. I listen to people. I listen to teachings. I have an eschatology, and I'd rather passionately teach it, but I always say, but look, I could be wrong, or you could be wrong, or both of us could be wrong. Can any man truly say, I have 100% full knowledge of eschatology. I know how it's going to work to the nth detail. I know what every passage in Revelation means. I know exactly how it's going to happen. I mean, there are some, if you say you do, and you pull out your charts and your graphs and your maps and put them up on the easel and say, yes, I know exactly how, please know, you have just now become a Pharisee.
Right.
I mean, because no living man knows exactly every jot and tittle of how it's going to happen. So let's leave a little room. You can be passionate about your eschatology. You can be passionate about what you think you see in the scriptures. Study the scriptures diligently. But remember, a lot of this has not yet come to pass. It's still unfolding.
Right.
A lot of it was written symbolically so that it would have meaning for all generations until it was finally fulfilled. Let's be careful. Now, let me give you an example. Let's go all the way back to the mouth of Jesus himself.
Mm-hmm.
He said, He said many things, but let's take two statements that Jesus said himself. Emphatically, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no man comes unto the Father but by me.
Right.
All right? That's
Right.
an emphatic statement. I think Jesus meant that literally, don't you?
I do, indeed.
I don't see anything symbolic in that at all, do you?
No, sir.
His words are emphatic. They are literal. They're easy to interpret. Now, you may disagree with what he said. That's between you and God. But you have to admit, you cannot interpret that symbolically.
That's right.
But this same Jesus also said,
Yes.
hey, you want to follow me? You must eat my flesh and drink my blood.
Right.
All right? Now, ask yourself, well, he meant that symbolically. Well, now, wait. How do you know? How do you know he didn't mean that literally? And how come you can just make that decision? Okay. The way we know that he meant it symbolically is because we put it in its context.
Right.
We read all the verses before it, all the verses after it. We read the whole teaching of Jesus. We read all of the Gospels. We read the entire New Testament. We read the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation, and then we understand he did not mean you have to be a cannibal to follow him.
Thank you. Yes, we conflate it all together into one common understanding.
Exactly.
You know, when Jesus, let me just say here, you take a breather there. Let me just say here though that I think it's very well settled that when Jesus was saying this is my flesh, that he wasn't actually stripping pieces of flesh off himself.
Right.
That it was.
There you go.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that pretty much settles that argument. But I mean, I get what you're saying. That I mean, if you want to understand the mind and the understanding of a topic, you have to be able to conflate everything the Bible says about that topic. And
exactly.
You understand that. You understand that better than anybody. We know that.
Yeah, and not only that, Mike, but when you come to Revelation, obviously it's filled with symbolism.
Right.
Now, obviously, there are some direct, literal things said in there as well. Literally. I mean, write these letters to the 7 churches, and the 7 churches are.
Right.
Well, we know those 7 churches existed. Those were literal letters to literal 7 churches. And there are a lot of other literal things said.
Right.
I think John was literally caught up to paradise. I think he literally was before the throne of God. But as he is given, as the seals are unsealed, and he's given a glimpse of the future, I think he begins to write using language that he has to describe. I mean, imagine yourself, Mike.
Yes.
If you were thrust 2,000 years into the future.
Right.
We know that John was thrust at least 2,000 years
That's
into the
right.
future.
Yes.
So if you were now taken in 2,000 years into the future, I mean, think about it, to the year 4014.
Right.
Can you imagine what you would see if we were all still here? If the world was still here? Could you imagine? How would you describe that?
Yes.
If God says, now use the words you have and the technology that you have and the language you have and describe what you're seeing in the year 4014.
Well, it's like this, or it's like that, or it's like this. Or,
It appeared to be. It looked like this. It sounded like this. It felt like this.
Right.
Okay. So when John starts describing these things that are going to happen thousands of years into his future, and perhaps in our lifetime, well, he has no words. He has not seen those technologies. He's not seen that world. In his time, the whole world had not been settled and discovered and divided into nations. And there weren't 7 billion people living on the planet, divided into several hundred nation-states of the world. I mean, how could he describe all of that?
Right.
Well, now we come to your original question.
Right.
Come to the trumpets. We come to the bowls of wrath. We run into these fractions. Let's just deal with the trumpets right now, because all of those, when they deal with fractions, they deal with 1/3. 1/3 of the earth was burned up. 1/3 of the ships were destroyed. 1/3 of the sea. 1/3 of the earth. 1/3 of the people. Okay. So here's what I say to Bible students. Look, is God big enough and accurate enough and exacting enough to pull off exacting 1/3 figures? Well, of course he is. And you and I have oftentimes pointed to, well, let me give you an example. The United States of America has about 330 million people in it.
Right.
We just heard the other day from the CDC that it has now been revealed that 110 million Americans have some form of STD, sexually transmitted disease.
1/3.
Well, that happens to be exactly 1/3.
Right.
Which is a biblical number of judgment.
Right.
Now, I mean, so you know, can God pull off exacting 1/3 numbers? Of course he can. But now, when I come to the trumpets, for example, here's how I interpret those. I say, first of all, they could be exacting numbers, for sure. I mean, in their ultimate fulfillment, they could be exacting numbers. But let's back up. Clearly, they're written a little more symbolically. We have to admit that. A little more symbolically, in that we're dealing with things that John has been thrust into. He's never dealt with before, technologies and occurrences in the heavens and on the earth, and the judgments of the last day, and right before the rapture of the church. I mean, so how does John deal with these things? Okay, let's talk about the fraction. What does that fraction mean? Well, 3/3 of something means everything, right?
3/3 is everything. Yeah, it's 100%.
Yeah,
right.
3/3 means everything.
Right.
2/3 means the most of something. Let's say you got a pie. All right, 3/3 that's the whole pie.
Right.
Well, 2/3 of the pie, that's not the whole pie, but
No,
it's
mostly.
the vast majority of it.
Right.
And a 1/3. All right, here's 1/3. Here's what 1/3 means. At the very least, symbolically, here's what it means. It's not the whole pie.
Right.
It's not even most of the pie.
Right.
But it's a significant piece, and it's big enough that you would take notice of it.
Right. Right.
So if something happens on the earth to the power of 1/3,
Right.
that means it didn't happen to the whole earth.
Right.
It didn't happen even to the most of the earth.
Okay.
But it did happen in such a significant way that the whole earth probably knows about it.
Right. Wow.
Okay? So
Yes.
at the very least, 1/3 means that.
Right.
Now, it's also important to understand, for context, it's important to understand biblical words.
Mhm.
You come to the word earth. It could mean the globe,
Right.
the entire planet. But you know what that word in Greek also could mean? And it is used frequently in Greek literature
Well, that's-
and in the Bible this way.
This is why we call you. This is why we call you. This is why we don't rely on my knowledge, because you understand these languages.
That same word, and I have this heavily documented in,
Right.
in a book that I've got coming out in February 2015. But that same word can also mean a specific portion of the earth, or a specific theater, if you will, a specific theater of where prophecy is going to be fulfilled, a specific section of land. It can even mean a specific nation. That word. Now, most of the time it's used, for the whole planet. But see, we use our language the same way, Mike. We'll talk about the earth as a globe, and then we'll talk about, he's the smartest guy in the world. Well,
Yeah,
do we
sure.
really mean that, or do we just mean
Right.
he's the smartest guy I know?
Right.
We can go on and on with the examples of how we
Sure.
use the same word in a multiplicity of ways, depending upon the context.
Right.
Well, when we're dealing with prophecy, we got to remember that prophecy, you have to start, is pretty much Middle Eastern centric.
Sure.
I mean, you can't sit in America or Canada and say, well, it's not happening here, so it must not be happening.
Right.
I mean, Starbucks is open. You're famous for saying
Yes,
that. Starbucks
right.
is open. NFL is playing tonight.
Yes.
My favorite movie's on TV,
Mhm.
so we must not be any tribulation happening.
Right. Right.
Well, wait. Let's go to the Middle East. Let's ask our brothers and sisters in the Middle East,
Right.
the 200, 300,000 people that are fleeing from Iraq and Syria and having their children's heads cut off and put on stakes and poles before their eyes, and their wives and daughters raped before their eyes. Do you think they might be in some tribulation right now?
Right. I mean,
You
absolutely.
see,
Sure.
it all began there. It's all going to end there.
Right.
I believe in the last days it will spread out into other parts of the world, to be sure. But let's start in the Middle East when we start interpreting prophecy. Let's don't start in Toronto, Canada, or Pensacola, Florida.
Right. Right.
We start in the Middle East and Israel. So when we come to these prophecies, and we discover that the word earth could mean a specific theater, and we discover that the word 1/3 doesn't have to mean a literal 1/3 number of the entire planet, but it could mean a large, significant portion of a theater where a prophecy is being fulfilled, so significant that the entire world knows about it, but not the whole earth, or not even the whole theater, and not most of the earth, and not even most of the theater, but a significant thing happens very specifically that the world knows this prophecy is being fulfilled. That's how I start with this, Mike. I hope this hasn't confused you or our listeners, but I start that way And then from there, I look for specific fulfillments, just like I was saying with the Center for Disease Control, and 1/3 of the American population now is afflicted with sexually transmitted diseases. That's a biblical number of judgment, and it's exacting. I mean, exacting according to the CDC figures. So, I mean, I look at that through a biblical worldview, and I say, oh my gosh, we're living in the last days. Israel's in the Lamb. The nations are surrounding them. Islam has arisen. Christians are being persecuted with great tribulation in the Middle East. Now in America, 1/3 of the entire population has the penalty of their sin in their bodies. I mean, we go on and on and on with these numbers. But I don't come to Revelation and look at this passage that says, 1/3 of the earth was burnt up. And say, oh, well, that hasn't happened.
Right.
That's something that's going to happen after the rapture because obviously 1/3 of the earth hasn't been set on fire. Well, that could be how it is going to happen. It could be. It could be that I'm wrong about what I'm getting ready to say next. It could be that that's going to happen. But what I'm getting ready to say next is it could also be that it means a specific theater and not necessarily a literal 1/3, but the understanding of 1/3.
Right.
And it could mean that something very specific and very literal happens in a theater that will point to that last day's prophecy so that the last day's generation will look at it and say, oh my gosh, that's us. We're now in the last days.
And this speaks to the reason why the real reason I had you on the show, and I guess I was being a little sneaky about it, but we've been saying on ppsimmons, Carl, for a long time that the first 5 trumpets have blown with shocking clarity, and that the 6th trumpet is imminent. And in the 6th trumpet prophecy, it says that a third of men, for to kill a third of men, is the expression that is used there. Now, some prophecy experts are saying that has to mean that 2.5 billion people are going to die in this particular war.
Yeah.
And
I disagree with that. I mean, it could be, and I leave room to be humbly wrong. It could be that 2.5 billion people die in that particular revelation of prophecy. But it could also mean that it is 1/3 of a specific theater, and the number 1/3 doesn't necessarily mean a literal 1/3 near as much as it means this huge, significant number of this specific theater where this prophecy unfolds, and you and I know there are key words in those prophecies that point to modern day events, and it could mean that. And what if it does mean that, Mike? That means we're now living in the trumpet days, which means we're very close to the return of the Lord, the rapture of the church, and we better get ready.
Right.
Instead of sitting around saying, oh no, all that stuff, I mean, God didn't put that there for us. He put that there for people, after the rapture, and people who want to read the Bible can see it then. And well, it could be that that's right, but I really don't think so in its proper context. I really don't think so.
No, and there's no reason to believe that's true. I mean, we have every reason to believe that we know that the direction we're in here and how far along we are. Although we're always making course corrections. We're looking at events in the news with one hand and the Bible in the other, and we're saying, hey, look, this matches up pretty accurately, and hey, look, this person's name is actually in the Bible, and exacting time frames are outlined in the Bible as they are happening on the earth, and like you said, you've got a book coming out in February, you say?
February 2015, yes, and of course people will be listening to this broadcast before then, and I can't give the title of it right now because it's under contract, but it deals with the book of Revelation and a lot of the stuff we're talking about, plus a whole lot more. But some people will be listening to this broadcast after February of 2015, and of course by then you'll know the name of the book, and hopefully it'll be another bestseller and all over the world. But in that book, I outline everything I just said, plus a ton more with profuse documentation and resourced information. Biblical, of course, contextual, out of the Greek and Hebrew dictionaries, but also right out of the headline news, and very reliable sources. I mean, National Geographic and even mainstream media, New York Times and Washington Post, and even the liberal media that chronicles and declares things, Mike, that they don't even realize what they're saying.
Well, and we look forward to that coming out, and hopefully it will cause people to not so much agree with us, but just sort of hit the restart button on their eschatology and what they've been taught over the years, and perhaps consider the very real possibility that the end time is not coming, the end time is now. Mr. Carl Gallups, always a pleasure to speak with you, sir.
Thank you. It's been my honor. And Mike, I do want to emphasize again, folks, I could be wrong about some of these things. I leave room to be wrong contextually now. Don't send me somebody's book about it, or don't tell me what the Left Behind series says, or don't refer me to a movie, but show me in the Scriptures contextually. Tie Scriptures to Scriptures. Let the Scriptures say what the Scriptures say, and I'm willing to be corrected. I want to be right, you know. I don't have an egotistical need to be right. I want to be right because I declare, thus saith the Lord. You know, I preach prophecy conferences all over the world. I teach from a pulpit. I'm on radio. I'm on television. I want to be humble enough that I don't make the pharisaical mistake of thinking I've got my eschatology all figured out to the point that I have just crucified Christ over again, you know.
Right.
So my book is the same way. I'm very passionate in my beliefs and the things that I think God has shown me, but I say throughout the book, listen, you know, I could be wrong. You measure this against the Word of God and against what's happening in the world yourself. But let me show you what I've discovered. And I think people are going to be pretty astounded when they read this, because there's some amazing stuff that not only have I just said, but I back it up with what media is saying and what the biblical languages say and what the context of the Word of God says. And it's pretty astounding stuff.
You get the last word, Carl. Thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedule to speak with us today. My name is Mike Shoesmith. You've been listening to ppsimmons Radio, the theater for the mind. We'll talk to you next time.